Hello, and welcome to Sounds Heal Podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Brown, and thank you so much for joining me as we continue to explore the fields of sound healing, sound therapy, and generally the use of sound for health and wellness. Today, our guest is Michael Reiley, who is a composer, musician, and teacher who uses the principles of sound therapy and deep listening in his work. He studied with Pauline Oliveros through the deep listening program. And his goal is really to help people slow down, unplug, and connect to themselves and the world around them through listening. So we talk about his background, his progression as a musician and composer, how he got into meditation and deep listening practices, and really how it shifted his approach as a musician and composer, and now as a teacher of deep listening and other practices. And it was so wonderful to talk to him about his background, soundscapes, field recordings, some really interesting work that he's done with sonic ecology as well. This podcast is sponsored by the Om Shop and Spa, located in Sarasota, Florida, also on the web at theomshop.com. The Om Shop has the country's largest showroom of vibrational tools, crystal bowls, and so many amazing instruments, specialty and custom instruments. And they can really help you and assist you with deciding what you might need for your sound therapy practice. They also offer in-house sound meditations and online through learning resources, blog, and they also host trainings and workshops as well. So thank you so much to the Om Shop and Spa for their sponsorship and support of this podcast. Please enjoy this episode with Michael Reiley. Okay, welcome, Michael. Thank you so much for joining me today for the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an honor to be on your show, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Let's, I know you really do have a background as a musician and composer first. So let's go back and talk about how music entered your life and kind of those early influences that really got you going, composing and performing.
Sure. Yeah, I had a kind of a circuitous path through like the DIY indie scene in Philadelphia, where I'm from originally. So I took piano lessons at an early age, but it was kind of quick. I think I was 7 or 8 years old, and kind of let them go and slowly got back into music in my teens. And so by the time I was in college, I was playing in a variety of rock bands and kind of gravitated towards electronic music. I played in a band, a couple bands that did basically like live techno music with like drums and people scratching on turntables. This is late 90s, early 2000s. And I was mostly playing synthesizers in those projects. And I was always very interested in soundscapes and sound design. So I tried to, my role in these projects was often sort of creating texture and color in among the beats and samples, and sometimes we would have singers or people rapping. But yeah, I was always kind of drawn to that idea of the the kind of like Brian Eno school of creating landscapes using sonic colors, almost like a painter would, to create soundscapes there. And as I continued to play in bands, I just very organically, like not with any sort of intention or any sort of direct, goals, I started to collaborate more with filmmakers and choreographers in Philadelphia. At first, just doing like improvised music, either solo or with small groups with dancers. And then that led to me writing more music formally for choreographers for their pieces, and for some filmmakers in around like the New York and Philly area. So that's when I sort of grew into this idea of like, oh, I'm a composer, because I was creating things that were being used. So I didn't go to school for composition. I'm not a formally trained composer. it's just it's very much organic sort of evolving process for me, this idea of being a composer. And it's often just an improvisation that happens, and somehow a frame forms around it, and I say, oh, okay, that's a piece of music. But to me, it still very much feels like sort of a co-creation process, not that I'm creating something. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned soundscapes, and of course, there's all this amazing work with soundscapes, sonic ecology,
Mhm.
sound walks, and I know that you did actually study with Pauline Oliveros, the deep
Mhm.
listening work, and I'm sure have looked into Marie Schaefer's work with acoustic ecology. So, how did that kind of draw you in to the listening? Uh, the aspects of deep listening.
Yeah, so sort of in a parallel path, but at the same timeline that I was exploring these different avenues of creation musically, I had a meditation practice that started around 2001, somewhere around that area. But I never really considered music and meditation to be in the same realm. It was like I had my meditation people, friends I would see on retreats, talk about with books, and I had like the music friends over here. Then in 2007, a friend of mine who was actually a dancer and choreographer in these groups that I was working in recommended that I apply for a residency with a composer named Pauline Oliveros. And to be honest, at the time I had never heard of Pauline, but she said, "Oh, you're into meditation, you're into music. I think you would really, really love Pauline." And it was an opportunity that Pauline came to Philadelphia and worked with about 10 musicians and composers for a 6-month period. So yeah, I was part of a group of about of these 10. It was I think it was like nine guys, one woman, I remember, and kind of like a lot of like young sort of machismo, like jazz and electronic and noise musicians. And we met with Pauline that first day, and I didn't really know what to expect. I got accepted to be a part of this group, and I think I maybe like did a little research online. I saw she was connected to sort of like the John Cage idea, the sort of philosophical ideas of listening and sound and awareness and meditation. But the day that I met Pauline and she worked with this group, it was really a sort of transformational, pivotal time for me. Just she explained deep listening to our group, but it didn't really click with me, at least. I was like, okay, this sounds cool. And then I think she could tell that we as a group weren't resonating with what she was trying to explain to us. So she's like, okay, let's do a score together. So we did this score called the tuning meditation, which to describe it briefly, it's basically as a group, you sing pitch, you sing a pitch to match other people, and then on the next exhale you sing a new pitch while you're walking around in the space. And as with many of her sonic meditations, it's a very simple score on paper, but the emergent results from performing this were really profound for me. And I was like, oh, okay, this is deep listening. And we so that day was really beautiful. And then we did, I think, about once a month for the next 6 months. She would come down to Philadelphia from upstate New York, and we would just do deep listening practices and improvise together, the 10 musicians. There's certain people in there who wrote scores specifically for the group, and that culminated in a performance at the Annenberg Center in Philadelphia in 2007. And it took me a little while, actually, to kind of see deep listening as this bridge between my meditation and music practice. I had her book, Deep Listening, a Composer Sound Practice, and I would read it from time to time. It would catch my eye on the bookshelf, and I would pull it down. I'd be like, oh yeah, deep listening. Uh, and yeah, it was kind of like these two slowly moving icebergs that finally came together about 5 years later. And I was like, okay, deep listening is this thing that can kind of connect these two energies for me, this meditation and music improvisation creative field. And so in 2016, I officially went into the deep listening training intensive, which was a year-long study with Pauline Oliveros, Ione, and Eloise Gold, who were basically the three founding members of the practice of deep listening. And it was primarily an online course. We did one, I was able to attend one in-person meeting, this deep listening symposium that was held at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute up in Troy, New York. And Pauline was there. Many of the people who had been involved in deep listening over the decades were all there. It was a really, really beautiful day. And it turned out to be the last time I got to see Pauline in person, because she passed away in November of 2016, right at the end of that intensive that we were doing.
Yeah, let's go ahead and define deep listening, as a person that practices it now and a teacher. How would you define deep listening and the practice of deep listening?
Well, I'll say that when Pauline was asked this question, especially towards the end of her life, she would always answer, "I don't know." So in honor of that answer, I'll first say, I don't know. It's a very Zen answer, because there's this idea that to define deep listening is to put it into a box, whereas it's a super expansive practice, I'll say. And the main components of it are listening and sound, the body, so listening with the body and the sort of energetic systems that are connected with the body, and also the imaginal space of dreaming. So how do we listen in dreams? How does our consciousness sort of complete the puzzle of what we're hearing in everyday life? And that's primarily the work of Ione, her Pauline's partner, and she's a wonderful, wonderful creative person, a poet. She creates plays and writer, and she sort of defined this listening and dream space. And so these three avenues, are these modalities as they're called, are sort of interwoven with one another. And in terms of listening, what's often a good place to start is the idea of what's the difference between hearing and listening. And so in deep listening, there's explorations of these different spectrums or spectra, I should say, the plural of spectrum of awareness. So that the exploration of the continuum between hearing and listening, between awareness and attention, between sound and silence, between inner and outer soundscapes, past, present, future, multidimensional listening. So it's this really beautiful, almost three-dimensional space of exploration of just how can sound be a transformative aspect in our life? How can bringing attention and awareness to the present moment engage us in a more interpersonal level? So there's elements of creativity in music. There's elements of sonic ecology, which you mentioned earlier. So like field recording, listening to nature, feeling that connection as part of nature, what that means. There can be interpersonal and transformative work in terms of our ability to have compassion, our abilities to heal. So yeah, it's a big complicated. I'm happy to go into more detail about any of those aspects, but that's sort of the big atlas of the multidimensional atlas of what deep listening is.
Yeah, well, we can approach it from, some different aspects, I guess, through meditation and deep listening, which obviously there's a lot of connections with the two of those. How, if you can find the words to express, how did it change your music and composition? What did you find shifted within you that then shifted what you were presenting as a musician?
I think one of the big shifts, and this comes directly from Pauline and her work, is that I would say I entered into this paradigm where you have the composer, the person that creates the music, you have the message that the composer is attempting to convey, and you have the audience, the listener, who is supposed to just kind of receive what the composer has created, and they either connect with it or they don't. Through deep listening, I really began to found that that hierarchy can become flattened. And so the intention that I bring, the way that my listening consciousness can illuminate the experience is just as important as the composer, the person who's created that sound. And that can be in a composed piece of music, that can be in an improvisation between musicians, or that can be listening to an environment. So it's, gets to this the Zen koan: if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there, does it make a sound? This idea that our a presence and our awareness completes this puzzle, completes this tapestry of connection that happens. So it becomes a really empowering act to listen, to have that miracle of awareness, that miracle of attention, to experience the totality of a sonic experience that has the potential to expand beyond just sound and listening, but it becomes a sort of multisensorial way of approaching the world that becomes very, very engaged, very activating, very alive.
And we'll talk more about some of your projects in a little bit. With this podcast being really focused on sound therapy and sound
Mhm.
healing, listening is a huge part of that, and we understand that both sound therapy and listening are actually ancient practices. They're
Yeah.
not this new buzzword,
Mhm.
right? And so I'm curious what your understanding is of the origins of some of these practices, but also why they're so important right now in the times that we're living in.
Yeah, that's a great point, and a very important one, that listening is one of the most ancient practices we have. And there's so much wisdom in indigenous cultures and practices of listening, because it's an act of connection. It's an act of oneness. And as a society, I think we've become very visually oriented, through screens, and also evolutionarily, we've developed this really primacy of seeing the visual field. Whereas listening, because it's something invisible that we're connecting to. The sounds, like, you can never see sounds. It's this ephemeral, ever-changing, impermanent experience of our sonic world. And there's so much wisdom in that, connecting to Buddhism, for example, this idea of impermanence, of not self, of emptiness, which, Shunyata and Mahayana Buddhism, this idea of the emptiness and silence that's a gateway to the interconnectedness of everything. And so there's so many traditions that deep listening has come from, and for sure the idea of sound healing is one of them. um, you know Listening in of itself can be healing. It can be a softening. It can be a almost like I want to say calcification, a de-hardening of the rigidity that comes from the thinking mind, that comes from categorization, that comes from hierarchical thinking, that the merging can happen where the listener, the sonic event itself, and what is being listened to start to become one. And it's another one of these sort of continuums where the separation between listener sound and what is being sound sort of melt. So that in itself can be a healing practice. Um, and when I was giving my little intro bio, yeah, I sort of stopped at deep listening, but that has also organically grown into this field of sound healing, which therapeutic music is a big part of what I create. And it's sort of a shift that I've had in the last few years towards playing music in a program called the Music for Healing and Transition program. And it's just a really lovely, for me, connection between the meditation work, deep listening, and now sound therapy.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Kind of merging of all
Mhm.
your interests and practices. And I wonder if you can maybe recommend a practice and kind of bringing us into deep listening in our present time. And especially the past couple of years with us really relying on technology more and more so, being on Zoom meetings all the time,
Yeah.
how can we counteract kind of what our devices are doing to us? I mean, what are our devices doing to our brains? And how can we perhaps counteract that with some of these practices you're mentioning?
Yeah, so actually, I just released a course called the Acousmatic Therapy course, which deals with this. It's a way to, it's a 6 module course of audio only, so there's no video involved, and it's basically a way that you can learn to change our relationship with our phones, with our screens, and as a way to sort of counteract, especially over the last 2.5 years with the pandemic of these constant Zoom meetings, which, I have a lot of gratitude for Zoom. It's a way way you and I are connecting today. And I've met and had a lot of beautiful relationships with people that I've met over the last 2 years on Zoom. But it's true that it's getting to the point where it's starting to have detrimental effects. So something from the course that I can offer that's a really simple practice is to uh, the liminal space when we first wake up in the morning. So with the pandemic, a lot of people who maybe had alarm clocks where they had to get ready and get started and get on their way to work or school, uh, maybe there's more space in that waking up period. There's not as strict a time to wake up. Obviously, it's not true for everyone. So if this can't apply to you and you have a very strict time that you need to wake up and you're not a morning person, but I love that morning time. It can be, even if it's just a minute or 2 minutes of just feeling that dissolving of the dream self, that time when the dreams are that we've just been having are maybe vivid in our body and mind, and just listening in the morning, especially in these like spring and summertime, if we're privileged enough to live in an environment with birds and the morning calls of nature. It's a wonderful time to just listen before we get out of bed, before we check our phone, before we even put our feet on the ground, to just sort of close our eyes and feel that expansion of that connection of listening. If you live in a city, this can be done too. There's a, it's all sound, and of course there's therapeutic benefits probably to more natural sounds as opposed to buses and cars and things that we have in a city. But the act of opening oneself to listening in those first moments in the morning, I think, can be a great way to sort of center and to begin a practice of listening and mindfulness of listening that can perhaps grow. And then you maybe will find throughout the day there'll be more moments where, instead of reaching for the phone as a distraction, if we're waiting in line somewhere, or yeah, just any time that there's that compulsion to check the phone, to just listen, to just connect with the environment and say, what's happening here? And to bring a curiosity and a joy to listening. I often, give this exercise to listen to our environment the way that we would listen to a new song that was just released by our favorite artist. you know like I grew up in the era of albums being released in stores and you would go buy the CD or the record, and you didn't know what it would sound like. I remember this very vividly with the Radiohead album Kid A in 2000. I was super excited because I read some articles that it was this new direction and they were getting into electronica, and it was, I loved OK Computer. So I would just remember going home and the intensity and the joy and the curiosity I brought to that first listening of the album. So to embody that feeling of connection, that excitement, that joy of listening in our everyday experience can be so lovely, and to just notice something in our environment that we didn't notice before. you know
Right, and it can really help shift your focus. I often recommend to people that have a hard time meditating because they
hmm
think they just need to clear their thoughts and be empty. Just focus on the sounds, and
yeah.
let that be your point of focus. And And yeah, what you mentioned about, being in nature versus being in the city at the beginning of the pandemic when things were really locked down, I remember seeing articles about how more natural sounds were coming into the cities, like New York in particular. I think a lot of sonic, uh, field recordings came out of how the sounds of the city really shifted as things shut down. Um, so yeah, I'm curious about your field recording work, and let's talk about any of your previous projects that you found really cool
Mhm.
or really interesting. I remember on your website there was one called Eco Zoo,
Mhm.
and there's a few other things. So
Mhm.
maybe talk a little bit more about some of that field work that you really enjoyed.
Sure. Yeah, that came about maybe, well, the idea of using field recordings as material for creating music, that really started to come about 7 years ago because I became a nomad. So around 2015, 2016, I began to um, left my home in Philadelphia and just started living in artist residencies in different places around the world. So I was hearing all these new sounds for me, which is really exciting. And so I decided to start recording these environments and using them as a material for creating work. And that was my primary way, almost like my main instrument, my main muse for creating sound. So I would take recordings and use them as material. I called it sonic photography. So this idea of taking audio snapshots of an environment, but then using sort of darkroom techniques like Ansel Adams and collaging, Rauschenberg, people who would take the material of photo and play with it in the darkroom and on the canvas. So I was doing a lot of that, and this was again informed by deep listening because this was an exploration I had at the time. So bringing to the field recordings a sense of what was happening on the interior while I was listening. So I would create maybe subtle effects like echo, reverb, um, resonant frequencies of sound above and below. And so this resulted in a couple of albums that I produced, that a series that I called Memories of Earth. So, because as I started doing more of this field recording and deep listening, I started to become aware of R. Mary Schaefer and Bernie Krause, who does a lot of field recording of sonic environments, showing that we're witnessing the changing of our environments. And even if maybe visually it doesn't change it that drastically, often there's signatures in the density of insects and birds and other animals that let us know there's a really traumatic, really drastic change happening. So this idea, memories of Earth, was maybe a double meaning of my memories of exploring the Earth, but also sort of snapshots of a unfortunately rapidly changing environment. And I think out of this grew this idea of the project Echo Zoo, which you mentioned. So this was a project that I worked on at several artist residencies, and it was basically a recreation, an imaginal recreation of the sounds and soundscapes of animals that have gone extinct during the human era. And I worked on it for about 5 years or so, this project. And it involved field recording in that I would record environments, like, let's say, elephants in Thailand. And I would take those elephant calls and see how could I manipulate them using software and different techniques on the computer to create a woolly mammoth. So I would take sort of the living relatives of these extinct creatures and create these imaginary soundscapes. And it was done in a way that, let's say, an artist would create a painting of a dodo bird. So there wasn't a lot of scientific rigor in, like, analyzing the skull structure and the potential vocal cords and things like that to make a super scientifically accurate. But again, it was this blurring of the internal and the outer soundscape. So it became both the calls of the animals, the imagined environments that they were in, but also how these creatures perceived sound was part of it. So especially when it was like an insect or a fish, something like that, I started to get into the idea of like, okay, well, how does a fish perceive sound? What does, a herring that's gone extinct in Germany, what does the Rhine River sound like to that fish? So it was, sort of experimental, sort of as playful as I could make it. But in the end, it was a super heavy project for me. These 5 years, sort of really getting into the, the sense of loss, the sense of these what I call nodes of consciousness. So a bear that's gone extinct, let's say, had a very unique way of perceiving the world. So not only do we lose that species, that way of perceiving the world has gone. That sort of very specific color of consciousness has left the world. So in the end, it became a very heavy project for me. I published it in 2000. And you can find it at echozoo.org. You can listen to the 66 creatures I made. I'm often obsessed with numbers and numerology, but I picked that because of the sixth extinction. So it's animals from 6 different continents, about 11 from 6 different continents. And it goes all the way. I think one of the oldest ones is the woolly mammoth, which went extinct. It's sort of when humans were in the ice age, but all the way up to like the golden toad, which is a toad that went extinct in Costa Rica. None of the creatures I did really had any recordings of the creatures. There was one bird, I think it's called the maho. I forget the name of it, but it's a bird from Hawaii, and that's the only one I used an actual recording of the bird. And this is one of these really poignant stories that this bird was rapidly going extinct, and they found one of the birds and brought them to the bird conservatory and found out this was actually the last bird of this species. And this bird was singing this mating song, just looking for another member, one of its species. And there's a recording of this, so that found its way into Echozoo. And it was a heavy project, but just this idea of listening, this idea of listening through the ages, and to maybe bring some attention and awareness and care to our current soundscapes, and to really appreciate what we have here and how rapidly it's changing as we experience this 6th extinction.
Wow, just a fascinating project to take on. Yeah. Well, you mentioned the course that I think you said you just released, that really
Mhm.
helps us kind of counteract some of our experiences with technology through listening. But I'm curious, it seems like you have multiple projects going on all the time. What else do you have ongoing right now, or coming up, that you're really excited about, or things you're curious about that are really drawing you in right now?
Yeah, so a lot of my time is spent with teaching. So that's through the Center for Deep Listening. So I'm usually teach about three intensives a year. I do one-off workshops. So I have a project with my partner, Monica. She's a dancer choreographer, and we have a project called Listening Bodies it was mostly before the pandemic. We were teaching around the world, and it was this idea of deep listening mixed with somatics. So I do those kind of projects. I'll be teaching a workshop in northern Italy at the end of July at a music festival called Next Tones Festival. And you can, if you're hearing this before the end of July and happen to be in that Switzerland, northern Italy area, want to check it out, I'll be there. I've been working with a group called Wave Paths, which is they create music for and as psychedelic experiences. So I just started working with them this year, and I created some music and soundscapes for their project, which is basically an interactive system that therapists who are working with psychedelic drugs with their patients for PTSD and trauma and depression, things like that. They can basically use this interface to create real-time music. So I've been creating a little bit of music for that project. And then I'm also working with this group, Science and Non-Duality, which has been really exciting. I've started sort of helping just on the technical side with them, like helping with their website and things like that. But that's morphing into some editing of articles and creation of articles and working on a podcast with them. So that is a really interesting bridge for me, this idea of science and spirituality, which is kind of interwoven into a lot of what I do. And yeah, that's the main projects I'm working on. I do a weekly meditation group called Sound Sangha, which is this basically exploration of mindfulness of listening. And that's where the course grew out of. So I've done this every Friday. A group of us get together and we explore a topic, do a period of listening meditation, and then have a discussion. And this acousmatic therapy course sort of grew out of that work to kind of create a really specific 6-step program for developing ease, developing a better sleep habits around develop better sleep, sort of listening with the full body, developing awareness. So kind of taking back our attention and awareness, with which the screens and social media companies have taken from us. Connection. So there's a module that involves sound walking. And I know you had Hildegard Westerkamp on your show. That was a really beautiful interview. So to hear about the sort of origins of sound walking. And then the final module is about silence. So just developing a healthy relationship with being okay with silence and space in our lives. So I just released that in May. So I'm sort of like still promoting that and helping people who are taking the course right now, answering questions and staying connected with that.
Now, are the Sound Sangha and the course, are those things that people can join in any time, or do you kind of roll them out every several months?
Sound Sangha is open. Yeah, it's people, you can drop in any Friday. There's a link to register on my site and send out the Zoom. And we meet Fridays at 12 o'clock noon. And Acousmatic Therapy is also, the course is also self-guided. So you can basically download that. You can download the MP3s or you stream it through your device or your laptop. And yeah, it can take anywhere from, the suggestion is 6 weeks. So to kind of do a one module a week, or it can take 6 months or a year. You kind of go at your own pace and see how long you need to stay in each module. Maybe, you really need to work on improving screen time around sleep. So you stay with that. With the course too, I didn't mention, it does have sound therapy in there too. So it's like, there's basically a discussion of the module. There's a guided meditation, and then there's a sound therapy section that's usually ambient music, something like the sleep ones to help you sleep. The cellular one uses certain frequencies that are said to help promote listening with the full body, tuned to 528 hertz, which I'm sure you're hip to all that, all those alternative tunings and ideas of frequencies. Yeah, so anyway, there's a lot in there. I think it's about 10 hours of audio material in the course. That's all, like I said, self-guided. So there's no structure or strict schedule to it.
And how about, your sound meditations or some of your music? How is that on your website as well,
Yeah.
or Spotify, or how is your music released usually?
Yeah, most of what I produce is on Spotify. It's also on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. I release things on Bandcamp, on a few labels. I did an album for this healing sound propagandist label last year. I did an album for an Italian label called Pregnant Void, which was, I created a suite of music that was based on the ratios and measurements of the 9 planets. So it's basically these frequency explorations, soundscapes based on the numerology and the ratios of the planets. So it's a, extension of the Holst idea, or the harmony of the spheres. And that was on Pregnant Void. And I did another album for Sacred Sea Records with an artist named Wild Anima, a French artist, early last year. So sometimes I self-release on Bandcamp, sometimes it's through a label. Most of my music these days, I'm kind of channeling. Through SoundSong, I have a Patreon, so my schedule is like on Monday, I release some sort of either therapeutic, field recording, sound healing, ambient music on Monday for the Patreon feed. And then Friday we do the class, and I record that and post that on Patreon too for supporters who can't be there live.
Great. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, well, it's really beautiful how, all your interests kind of merged into what you're doing now, that this path, it seems like it's really, everything's aligned for you as far as, the meditative spiritual practices and your music and this deep listening. As far as maybe research or studies, is there anything that you're really interested in new that you're diving into just personally for a practice?
In terms of research, well, I'm always usually reading some sort of book about meditation, sound, or mindfulness. Right now I'm reading a book called Earth's Wild Music. I'm blanking on the author's name, but it's this really beautiful essay about this idea of loss of soundscapes. Yeah, I can look it up if you want real quick, but people can also Google it. It's called Earth's Wild Music. Yeah, and the idea of sound healing and therapeutic music, I was doing this course, Music for Healing and Transition program, which led me into a lot of areas that I sort of neglected and didn't research that much. This idea of sort of specific frequencies for healing, modalities for how to play for people in hospice or at hospitals. I just finished what's called my practicum. So the practice, I was back at home in Philadelphia earlier this year, finishing my 45 hours of playing in hospice. So it was a really powerful, transformative time for me, playing for people at the end of life. And I feel like that work is still sort of resonating with me. I'm still sort of experiencing the echoes of that work. So for me, it's, I do like to read and research, but I'm also very experiential. I think maybe as my background as a DIY, do it yourself, indie, sort of roll up your sleeves and just try it musician, I'm very much into sort of the experiential. And I love to read. I love to find out what people are thinking and different theories and new modalities of whether it's listening or sound or mindfulness. But I like to just get out and try it and do it.
Yeah, definitely. With all these things that we're talking about, I always say experience is the best teacher, right? You can read about riding a bike, but you have to get out and do it to actually figure it out. Yeah. Well, wonderful. Any kind of last things you'd like to let us know about, or things we should, keep posted about with your work? Any kind of final announcements or thoughts?
I don't think so. I think I kind of announced or mentioned everything that I have going on now a little earlier. But thank you for the opportunity to do that, to mention what I have going on. My web, you'll have it in the show notes, I'm sure, but it's just soundoflistening.com. So all the different projects I'm associated with, things I'm offering are all there. There's a lot of free music to listen to and connect with on the website and through the different services. So yeah, but thank you so much for this opportunity, but thank you too for this podcast. I'm a huge fan. I listen to many of the episodes you put out, and it's just great to hear these in-depth conversations with a wide range of people, from instrument makers, luminaries like Hildegard Westerkamp. Yeah, actually, I'm in Italy too. I didn't mention that, but my partner's Italian, and we're slowly relocating there. And I want to connect with the Grotta Sonora, the couple you
Grata
spoke with.
Sonora. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they're
Absolutely.
down near Rome, and
That's
I've
right.
I looked up their website from hearing it on your podcast. So I want to connect with their magnificent gongs and meet them someday.
That's right. Absolutely, you should. Yeah. Well, beautiful. Well, good luck with your, the course coming up at the end of July and all
Thank
the
you.
new things you're rolling out with your online stuff too. And yeah, it's just wonderful to hear how all your interests and passions and practices have aligned. So I'll be definitely trying to keep up with what you have coming out and yeah, keep following the path.
Thank you. You too.
Yeah.
Be well. Thanks,
Thank you.
Natalie.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Sounds Heal Podcast, sponsored by the Om Shop and Spa. You can keep up to date with what's coming up next at soundshealstudio.com. Check things out on Facebook at Sounds Heal Studio, and you can listen to all previous podcasts as well as music meditations on the YouTube channel at Sounds Heal Studio. Be well and stay tuned.